You got me on? We're going to go to our next session. So wrap up our discussions. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed that one. It's a little technical, a little bit more about hospital operations, which is not exactly what we're all about doing today, at least many of us. But maybe that's why we're not doing it anymore, because we saw all these challenges coming down the road. Our next presenter is Steve Maag. He's one of the key executives at Leading Age, which is a support and advocacy association for nonprofit residential communities. In his work at Leading Age, Steve helps lead boards through a review of strategy based on best practice model programs from around the country. So Steve's got a wealth of knowledge of some of the other programs that are certainly vibrant. When I approached Steve about the idea of this retreat and shared with him some of our broad community plans for our community, he was very interested in coming and speaking, partly because he said, you know, a lot of times I'm going to these board meetings and having to convince boards about the next things that they should do, and you're already thinking about them, so all I can do now is come and endorse and give you advice and encouragement. So he was already thrilled that we're pretty far down the road of on the road less traveled, so to speak. So I'd like to welcome Steve to the podium, and he's going to give us a great presentation.
Thank you, Ron. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I think you should all be commended for this presentation, and Ron deserves a huge round of applause for this a wonderful presentation groups today. You can see I titled this Developing the Sun Health Family for the Consumer of the Future. I think the word that I want to emphasize is to get back to the consumer. We've been talking a lot about health today. You've heard health used a lot. I'm going to kind of step us down one notch and talk a little bit about the consumer, because ultimately that's what we're here for. I thought it was interesting listening to Susan just a minute ago make a distinction that I think to some extent illustrates some of the fundamental issues we have. She made the distinction between a patient and a consumer. I don't think there's a distinction. The patient is the consumer. And I think that's part of why we still have and have historically had some difficulty in changing the system and having a different approach, because we keep separating these people out, and we're all the consumer. We have different roles in that role. We can be family members, we can be caregivers, we can be the people receiving the services, but ultimately we're all consumers. So I want to talk a little bit about the consumer. Some of this you will know, and one of the disadvantages of being towards the end of a program is some of what I was going to say or planning on saying has kind of been talked about already. But one of the advantages is I can try and change some things so that I have something a little bit different. So if I pause for a second, it's because I'm rethinking what I thought I was going to talk about this morning. We know that senior services are changing. You've heard a lot about one of the drives. There's two things that I think are making the difference right now. The first one is what you heard this morning and just now from Susan, is the healthcare reform. That's changing the game tremendously. And in 15 years, we won't recognize the system. Change will be there because it has to be there. If it isn't, we're really in a world of hurt. The other part of the reason for the change is the consumers. So let's talk a little bit about the consumers. How are they changing it? What's their role? We need to understand those consumers. It's a little bit of the why kind of approach that we were talking about earlier with one of the other presentations. It's not why you're doing this, but it's why some of the motivation for this. You know, we know historically we've had an event-driven system. You know, somebody got sick, they went to the hospital. Somebody had a fall, they went into rehab after a hospital stay. It was all event-driven. How we structured it operationally and governmentally was very much, here's the services, you had this problem, here's where you go. And we kept slotting these people into silos and putting them into individual things. And that worked relatively well until now we're starting to realize that that's not going to work into the future. But the consumer at the center of this didn't make any changes. So how are we going to be different in the future? Well, first of all, let's figure out who we're serving and how this works. We know that most senior services providers really start to deal with their consumer customers at about age 80. If you go across the country and look at retirement homes, CCRCs, assisted living, those kind of programs. Most of them start to deal with residents when they're in their 80s. A few, some of the retirements will do when in their 70s, but still 80 is pretty average. They start to think about it in the mid-70s, but they really don't make the decision until the 80s, until their 80s. So what does that mean demographically? Let's do a little quick demographic. If you go back and just use some rough numbers, 80 right now goes back to 1933. So we have been historically up to now serving people born before that time period. Who were they? That's the World War II generation. That's the people who fought the World War II, who lived through World War II, lived through the Depression. They were formed by those values, by that era for them. What's their biggest values? Security, stability. They knew instability. They knew hard times. They knew tough sacrifices. So they reacted to that. Their goal was to have the career, provide a roof over their heads. You know, the status quo was fine with them. They were not very demanding. That's who we've been serving. So that whole system that we've had now that I talked about earlier that was episodic based, that you got plugged into it, that was fine because that's what they were used to. You know, that was their mindset. Well, that's the generation that is now transitioning out. And we're moving into the next generation, which is the silent generation. That's the people that came of age between about 1930 and 1946. The older generation of that, the older silents, the ones that were born between 1930 and 35, have some of the characteristics of the World War II generation, but not quite to the same. The ones born after 1935 are pretty consistently seen as to have a different mindset. They came of age in a different kind of era. World War II, post-World War II boom. Remember, after World War II, of the four major economies across the country, Germany, Japan, Britain, and the United States, 3 of them were decimated by the war. They had to totally rebuild their infrastructure. They had huge population losses, so it took them years to really rebuild. We came through the war relatively unscathed, both from a population standpoint and, more importantly, from an infrastructure standpoint. So we were able to take advantage of that, and the post-World War II boom, we took off. You know, it was that era after World War II and Eisenhower era when the U.S. markets were by far the dominant markets across the country. So that changed their mindset. You know, that was how we grew, that cohort grew up. They're the first ones that were used to TV. They were the first ones who were the pop culture, the early rock and roll eras. They were experiencing the Cold War, different kinds of mindsets. They launched the age of computers. There was a special on Frontline the other day talking about the early computer age. And all the people that started the computers were all people that were born in the 30s, that started in the 50s and the 60s with the early IBMs and the Univacs and ENIACs and all those great big, you know, room-sized computers. Those were all silent generation people. So they are really the computer age people, not us baby boomers. It was the silent generation, so they're used to technology. They're smaller in number, so we don't have as many of them. They're better educated. One of the greatest things that happened to this country, bar none, is something that most people don't think about. If you think about one of the seminal events in the United States that helped us move forward in the latter half of the 20th century, you know what it is? GI Bill, absolutely right. That afforded college for lots of people. Before World War II, who went to college? Well, occasionally an athlete did. If you were rich, you went. Other than that, you know, you went into business, you farmed the family farm. People just didn't go to college. They were lucky to get out of high school. World War II changed that. It became much more accessible. Community colleges sprang up all over the country. So the silent generation was the first generation to benefit that. So they're much more highly educated, much more affluent. They're the last generation that can rely on pensions. They're not like me, the 401 that goes to a 201 is now kind of back up to a 301. You know, and men are living longer. So we're getting more couples moving in their late 70s, early 80s. Us men are finally catching up to the women. Now, as baby boomers, the statistics will show, you know, we're living longer, but we're not living healthier, which is another thing that I'll talk about in a minute. But that's the two cohorts, and the attitudes are different. And that's why, as we're transitioning, when you're looking at all this healthcare reform, and you're looking at what you're setting up and how you're setting up a program, remember, what you're used to now is not who you're going to be serving from now forward. The World War II residents that you had and have served traditionally up till now, you take care of their needs, they want security. They're fine with that job, food, roof over their head kind of approach. The silent generation expect you'll take care of their needs. I mean, the basics should be there, but they will want and demand you to work with them to serve their wants. They are much more demanding. They want more things. And that's a significantly different attitude than the World War II generation. That silent generation I consider a precursor to the boomers. The latter part of the silent generation is close to the boomers, just like the first part of the silent generation is closer to the World War II generation people. And we know the studies on boomers. I mean, we're the ones that are going to change the healthcare system. Well, if it isn't changed by the time we start to hit it, we're in big trouble, because remember, if you think about most of the seniors accessing the healthcare continuum for our components, the senior services, at age 80, although it may be a little bit younger now because we're not as healthy, that puts it at 20 and 20. That's 2025. So we're not even close. We're still at 6 or 7 years before boomers start to do a lot. I was at a conference the other day, and there was a gentleman from a health system on the East Coast, and they've been doing some statistical analysis, and they said that they've been tracking the occurrence and costs of healthcare across an age continuum, and they said you can plot it along, and it goes very flat until you hit age 46, and then it starts to go up like this, and when you hit age 55, it starts to go up. By the time you hit 65 to 70, it's going through the roof. And so now that's where the baby boomers are starting to move into. They're a little bit different than silent generation, more demanding, more lifestyle-oriented, more wellness-oriented, more education-oriented, want more demands, want technology. There's been several studies, and they want to say in their life choices. They want to have a voice in what they're doing. I consider it, born and raised in Seattle, it's the consummate Nordstrom way. For those of you who are familiar with the Nordstrom retail company, you take something back and it's no questions asked. That's what the baby boomers are used to, and that's what there's going to be demanding of them. So how do you position yourself? How do you respond to this? We've looked at the healthcare environment. You've heard a lot of information today, great information. I'm going to step it down and say, let's just talk about the attitudes and how you position yourself to respond to this new generation coming along, and ultimately the boomers. First of all, one key component, we know that 80 to 90% of the people that surveyed say they want to stay in their own home. MetLife did a study last year, it was 83%. We also know that when you look at the data, there's a group out of Annapolis called the National Investment Center, and they do market analysis across the country on about 80% of the country. And when they look at the market penetration rate for age and income qualified seniors, 8 to 12% of those seniors are actually living in retirement communities. So there's 88 to 90% of the seniors who aren't living in retirement communities who are age and income qualified. In other words, they could if they chose to. So, and we also know that we've got an increasing demographic. People are living longer, the boomers are coming along, so we know we're going to have a lot more people. So what do? Well, first of all, you do what you guys are doing. And I'll go over this part really quickly, because I stood out at the dinner last night and looked across the lot there, and you're changing your physical plan. You need to make sure that you've got a physical plan for your physical plant building related services that's attractive and will draw these people in. When I do this presentation to boards, I go through a whole list of things that people are looking for, and we obviously with the TED time, we don't have time for that. But they want diversification changes. What are your options? First, you look at your community. Are you going to be positioned to provide services in 2025? Are you going to be attractive? Second, is there an opportunity for new growth, new greenfields? Exactly what you're doing across the street, expanding, building things new. And third, and I think by far the most important, how are you positioned to provide services to the community customer? And by community, I mean the big picture. I'll go over this real quick. Reposition or remodel. Look at your grounds, doing what you're doing. Make sure that you're ready for that consumer who's going to be much more demanding, much more services, a lot more amenities. New campuses, affiliations. That may be something you can do. I know you've got some land, you're doing that, so that's a component of it. But I think the most important one is to look outside the community. Use the 90-90 rule. I made that up. Not too tough to make up when you look at the data. 90% of your customers don't want to come on a campus, and 90% of your customers are, in fact, based on data, not coming on your campus. So where's the market into the future? There's a huge market out there. 90% of the seniors who are age and income qualified are out in the community. So you've got to, and you guys as providers of senior services know how to do this better than anybody else. You can expand to become the dominant leader in your community. Become what I say at the bottom there, a community center for healthy aging. You need to be the voice for healthy aging in this community. And that means not just on your campus, but taking what Ron was talking about and expanding your services outside. There's lots of ways to do it. I'll only talk about a couple of these. You know, the CCRC Without Walls model is something that's getting a lot of buzz. That's taking a life care contract concept, in other words, a package of services, and instead of having somebody move on campus for it, taking that out and signing them out on the community. We heard a lot just a few minutes ago about coaches and wellness coaches, and that's part of the concept is they sign up for a service so people come to them and help them with their wellness and help them with their lifestyle and have a motivation. So it's an active program out into the community and outreaches in the community. There's lots of ways to do that. There's lots of different kinds of programs to do it. The affordable housing with services, I was talking last night at dinner, for every one affordable housing unit in the United States, there's 10 people on a waiting list. But in those current affordable housing units, we've got lots of seniors that have no services. So look to low-income housing. Can you meet some needs out there? Because that's the kind of thing that you do well, is provide services. There's lots of ways to access people in their homes. There's lots of technology that we're starting to do. The message really is to take a look at, first of all, making sure your core business is in good shape. And Ron, looking at this stuff, you guys are doing a great that. Your campuses are great. The foundation is doing fantastic things. You're well positioned to then say, how can we take what we do and provide it out? And in addition, it also satisfies your mission. You need to remember that part of what you need to do as a community provider, whether you're not-profit or for-profit, but certainly as a not-for-profit, that part of what you should be doing is meeting needs out in the community. And that doesn't mean meeting needs of people that have six-figure incomes. We had a news story break in St. Louis. I won't bore you all the details. It has to do with a property tax exemption fight. And it's a CCRC where the average entrance fee is about $400,000. And the community is looking at that and going, they get a property tax exemption? That's a place for rich people. Well, that's what we've got to get past. We have to be able to say, we have an array of services. We're meeting the needs of all the community. We have programs reaching out into the community, approaching ways to get to low-income people, middle-income people, have the kinds of programs that you can do. It takes a little bit of work, obviously. You need to do an analysis of what you got. You are situated as unique as almost anybody in the country because you've got a captive audience. I've got some friends, I'm staying with some friends that live a mile from here, and I've been down in this area 30 or 40 times over the last 10 years. And I know what Sun City, Sun City West, Sun City Grand are like. I mean, you've got a huge captive audience here, a captive market that is perfect for the kinds of programs because a lot of those people have moved because this is where they want to live, but they're going to age in place and need services. And you've got a huge demographic here. So you need to figure out what they have, what they need, how to get to them, what kind of programs are there, what kind of programs are being served by somebody else. There's nothing wrong with affiliating with somebody who's meeting some of the needs already. No reason to reinvent the wheel, but there are certainly programs that you can work on to develop that will do things differently in the past. Talking to the key area professionals. Ask the current and potential future residents. Do some focus groups. Do some things to find out what do they want. The CCRC Without Walls model that I touched on briefly has different iterations. There's different ways to do that. And in some communities, it works one way, and in other communities, it works another way. So there's no one size fits all. But there are lots of opportunities. But really the important thing is to get that consumer voice. And I think it's important for us to remember that we're fundamentally serving the seniors, serving the consumer. And that's how we need to tailor our message. And it is not just the people trying to attract them on campus. It's all the consumers. You've heard a lot of that today. We've talked about that, and we've had different iterations of that. I wanted to bring this down and say, here's the real nuts and bolts of it. This is really what you're all about, is you're really all about figuring out of the thousands of people that live within 20 miles of these campuses, how do you get out and reach them? because healthcare reform is going to demand it, for one thing. It's going to make it more feasible to do. Second of all, it's the right thing to do because it's a good thing for those consumers. And third of all, that's where your market is. Just remember the 90-90 rule. That's where your future market is. We can't build enough campuses to serve those people. They're just physically impossible to build that many bricks and sticks to meet those kinds of needs. So we have to say, let's start figuring out how to do it. You're starting that. I've talked to Ron. As Ron said, I feel a little bit like preaching to the choir because you're well on that way, but I'd strongly encourage you to continue that path because I think that's the path of the future. And I've done these presentations to dozens of our members across the country, and that's pretty much what most everybody else is thinking too, is that we may build some new campuses, but what we have to do is become community centers for healthy aging. So when people say, gee, I need a resource, somebody calls up and says, I need this, there's a central phone line or there's a resource that you've developed to be able to say, okay, here's the array of services. Now let's talk. What's your situation? What do you need? And how can we meet your needs? And that may mean a visit, that may mean a wellness program, that may mean a referral to somebody else, but you need to be the place that everybody says, oh, we're calling Sun Health because they know how to take care of seniors and do it in a healthy, active, well-managed approach. This I put in at the very end because what it shows you is at the bottom across there, that's a sampling, not exclusive, but a sampling of all the kinds of services that provide care to seniors. The thing to remember about this is look at the continuing care retirement community multi-level campus. They already do most of this. You already have the expertise to do most of this. When you look at the individual silos, nursing homes know how to do nursing homes. Assisted living know how to do assisted living. I don't want to impugn any of my acute care provider folks in here, but acute care hospitals know how to do acute care work. CCRCs are the only sector that crosses all these boundaries more successfully than anybody else. So you guys have the expertise. We just need to figure out how to translate that expertise into programs that you developed to provide care to the seniors living in the local community that you're surrounded with. So with that, I appreciate the time. It's been a great day, and obviously open for questions. And I forgot my water, and I didn't have a Mark Rubio moan.
Question, somebody's got a question, for sure.
Oh, they're getting tired. It's getting to the end of the day.
Yep. Well, we're not going to let them off that easy. So are there some models of community programs like you've just described that you think have been terribly successful? And
there are some across the country.
We've been looking at them, but I'm just curious if you could comment on it.
And if I had more time, I would go to some. But for example, the one that most immediate comes to mind, as I mentioned, the one in Southeast Virginia, Riverside, who is affiliated with an acute care hospital. It's got a lot of acute care, but they have a very comprehensive senior care wellness program that has CCRCs and has everything else. And they've developed the resource management component to it. So they are the ones that are looked at. If we need something, that's the number to call to figure out the system. We heard earlier today about the confusion that seniors have when they need something, or the family members of the consumers. When they need some service or they've got a problem or they've got an issue, where do you turn? I mean, we've all started to see that. My mother died a year and a half ago, and we were struggling with that. My mother-in-law is currently residing in a skilled nursing facility, and we went through about 5 or 6 months of just real difficult times because we didn't know exactly who to turn to. We live in Virginia, she lives in Seattle, and we're trying to coordinate this. And even though I'm an expert, I've been doing this for 30 years, when you actually have to start figuring out how to do it, it's a nightmare. And who to contact and who to call and who can do this and where do you go and all those kinds of stuff. That's the kind of program, and that's one of the things that the Riverside, for example, has done a very good job of establishing a program to assist seniors and consumers.
So you've given us a lot to think about, Steve. And
okay.
Any other questions? Steve will be here the rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we're going to take some time to have discussion. So a little table discussion time.